Okay, so I want you to imagine a giant number floating right in front of you, like slightly
The
cracked.
correct number. Ugh.
Yeah, and the number is 21.9%. And right next to it, there's this heavy gray arrow pointing straight toward the ground.
That is a very specific visual.
Just, hold that image in your mind for a second. 21.9% pointing down. Because usually when we talk about human progress, the narratives we hear are, they're overwhelmingly triumphant, right?
Oh, absolutely. The lines on the graphs are always pointing up.
Right. We're constantly told the world as a collective whole is getting richer, that people are living longer.
The technology is, connecting the most remote corners of the globe.
Exactly. The grand story of the 21st century is supposed to be this relentless upward hockey stick graph of improvement.
But there's a catch.
A huge catch, because if the world has supposedly gotten so much better over the last 30 years, why does it feel like, well, everyday people are actually getting less?
Yeah, it's a massive disconnect.
Why does your own personal, sense of gain feel completely disconnected from the glowing economic reports we constantly hear on the news?
It is arguably the ultimate paradox of our modern era. I mean, we're living in a time of unprecedented absolute growth.
Right.
Yet there is this pervasive, lingering feeling of systemic fragility in our daily lives. We see the aggregate numbers, global GDP hitting new milestones, AI
For
breakthroughs.
varying diseases.
And from a distance, the architecture of human civilization looks fantastic. But when you zoom in on the actual distribution of that progress, the picture fractures.
I totally shattered.
And that cracked number you just mentioned, that 21.9%, that is mathematical evidence of that fracture.
So today we are doing a deep dive into a massive stack of United Nations data. This covers 3 decades of human progress, and we're anchoring it around a new, incredibly detailed comparative study.
It's a fascinating piece of research.
It really is. We are basically putting the entire globe's progress on trial. And to really understand where the system breaks down, we're using one nation at the extreme margins as our star witness.
Guinea-Bissau.
Exactly, Guinea-Bissau. We're going to look at millions of data points tracking health, education, wealth from 1990 all the way to 2023.
And the mission here is to uncover what the researchers call the fragility boundary of global development.
Because this research introduces a concept that completely, rewired how I think about global economics. They call it development evaporation.
Yeah, development evaporation is just a phenomenal term because it captures the physics of what is actually happening to our global wealth.
How so?
Well, we often treat development as a tangible object, right? We think of it like mining gold or building a bridge,
You do the work, you build it, and it's there.
permanently there. But development is actually a fluid dynamic. It flows through the plumbing of a society, through its institutions, its tax systems, its labor markets.
And it's social safety nets, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And if that plumbing is riddled with leaks, the water simply never reaches the faucet in the average person's home.
So that 21.9%, that's the measurement of the leak.
That's the evaporation.
It means that globally, more than 1/5 of all the development we generate, the wealth, the health interventions, the educational resources, it simply vanishes.
It evaporates in the distribution process.
Because of systemic inequality, you don't even get to experience it. I want you, listening right now, to imagine looking at your life's labor over the last decade
Think about that.
and realizing a quarter of your potential was just siphoned off into the ether before it ever reached your bank account or your community.
It really explains that collective feeling of running on a treadmill.
It totally does. But to really grasp how this evaporation mechanism works, we have to establish the baseline. We need to look at the grand 30-year climb of the Global Human Development Index.
Right. So the Human Development Index, or HDI, is essentially the United Nations' ultimate scorecard for humanity.
Because for a long time, economists just looked at GDP, right? Gross domestic product.
Yeah, and GDP is a very blunt instrument. It just measures the sheer volume of money moving around.
Which doesn't tell you much about a regular person's life.
Exactly. The HDI was created to answer a much more profound question. What is the actual quality of a human life? So
Yeah.
it combines 3 pillars.
Health, education, and wealth.
Right. A long and healthy life, measured by life expectancy. Access to knowledge, measured by years of schooling. And a decent standard of living, measured by per capita income.
And it synthesizes all of those into a single score between 0 and 1.
And the macro story over the last 3 decades is undeniably positive.
Right.
I mean, in 1990, the world HDI stood at 0.608.
which, just for context for everyone listening, 0.608 is a world where the internet was barely a concept for the public.
The Cold War was just ending.
Right. And global supply chains were, like, primitive compared to today.
Precisely. And from that 0.608 baseline, we saw a steady, almost rhythmic climb. It was the golden age of globalization.
So by the year 2000, the score moved to 0.651.
By 2010, it hit 0.707.
And by 2019, right before the pandemic hit, humanity as a collective had pushed that score to a historic high of 0.745.
It's a grand upward staircase. On paper, it represents millions of people lifted out of extreme poverty.
Global vaccination campaigns eradicating diseases.
Schools being built in communities that had never had formal education. The momentum of that global growth was an absolute behemoth.
But then the data reveals a really jarring disruption.
It really does.
Because for the first time in 30 years, the very first time since the HDI was created to track this data, global progress didn't just plateau.
No, it physically went backward.
Yeah. In 2020-2021, the global HDI dropped consecutively, falling from 0.745 down to 0.742.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because I'm looking at these numbers, and I have to admit, on paper, a drop from 0.745 to 0.742 sounds, well, microscopic.
It sounds tiny. It's 0.003 of a point.
Right. If my credit score drops by a fraction of a percent, I don't even notice. So why is this tiny statistical dip treated by the researchers as this catastrophic, terrifying event?
That is the exact friction point where abstract statistics fail to convey human reality. You have to conceptualize the sheer massive inertia required to move the global HDI even 1,000th of a point.
Because it's averaging the whole world.
Exactly. This index averages the lives of 8 billion people. It is like a supertanker moving at full speed across the ocean.
So for a supertanker to not just slow down, but physically start moving backward.
It requires an unimaginably violent opposing force.
So what does a 0.003 drop actually look like on the ground?
It looks like systemic collapse. That drop means that within a 24-month period, millions of human lives were lost prematurely to a novel virus.
It means the global supply chain of basic medical goods ruptured.
Yeah, and tens of millions of children were pulled out of school, many of whom, especially in developing nations, will never return, losing critical years of cognitive development.
It means entire regional economies shrank.
Erasing trillions in wealth and throwing millions back below the poverty line. That tiny decimal drop encapsulates a brutal V-shaped shock that erased nearly half a decade of human progress almost overnight.
It was a stress test that revealed the absolute resilience limits of our modern civilization.
When you frame it as the momentum of 8 billion people suddenly throwing it in reverse, the scale of the tragedy really hits you.
It's staggering.
Now, the data does show that the trajectory has since shown a steep rebound. We hit the bottom of the V-shape and bounced back.
Yeah, by 2023, the global average actually hit a new high of 0.756. So the system recovered.
Well, the aggregate system recovered, yes. The wealthiest nations stabilized their markets, they rolled out vaccines, and stimulated their economies.
But this is exactly where the comparative research forces us to change our perspective.
Right, because if a tiny statistical dip represents a massive catastrophic shock to the entire robust global system.
What happens to a nation that is already living at the absolute margin?
Exactly. What happens when the external shock of a global crisis collides with profound internal fragility?
Which brings us to the star witness of this deep dive, Guinea-Bissau.
For some geographical context, Guinea-Bissau is a small nation on the Atlantic coast of West Africa.
And it has a very complex history.
Yeah, heavily scarred by a grueling war for independence from Portugal, followed by decades of political instability and military coups.
And when we look at their specific coordinates on this global map of progress, the picture is deeply conflicting.
Because the data shows Guinea-Bissau's HDI grew from 0.412 in 2005 to 0.514 in 2023.
So they are growing. They crossed the 0.500 mark.
But they still currently rank 174th out of 203 countries globally.
Crossing that 0.500 threshold is an essential psychological and statistical milestone.
Right. It means they're making headway.
Exactly. It means Guinea-Bissau is firmly trying to pull itself out of the lowest tiers of human development. It represents real, undeniable internal progress.
But development doesn't happen in a vacuum.
No, it happens relative to the rest of the world. And that is where the vulnerability lies.
I was reading through the data tables, and the analogy that kept coming to my mind was trying to run up a down escalator.
Oh, that's a brilliant way to put it.
Like, Guinea-Bissau is moving their legs. They are putting in the effort. They are building clinics. They are trying to stabilize their government.
But the escalator, the global average, is moving away from them at an astonishing speed.
Exactly. In 2005, the gap between Guinea-Bissau and the global average was about 0.269 points.
And
Today, with the world sitting at 0.756 and Guinea-Bissau at 0.514, that absolute gap hasn't closed at all. Depending on the specific metric you isolate, it's actually widened.
the escalator analogy perfectly captures the exhaustion of developing economies. What we are witnessing here is the paradox of relative poverty in an era of absolute growth.
Can you break that down a bit more?
Sure, a child born in Guinea-Bissau today unquestionably has better prospects than their grandparents did.
Right, absolute growth.
However, the world around them has advanced so rapidly in artificial intelligence, in global trade networks, in advanced medical treatments, that the pressure to catch up in a dynamically stratifying world is immense.
The goalposts don't just keep moving, they are strapped to a rocket.
Exactly. When the global economic standard becomes automated logistics and mRNA vaccines, simply achieving basic sanitation and primary education, which, again, is a massive victory internally for Guinea-Bissau.
Right, it's huge for them.
But it leaves you fundamentally further behind the global economic frontier than you were 20 years ago. The relative distance between your lived reality and the global standard is staggering.
To really understand what an HDI of 0.514 actually feels like on a human level, we can't just look at an abstract index score.
No, you have to look at the most fundamental metric of all.
We have to look at time.
Life expectancy is the ultimate foundation of human development. Without time, no other progress matters.
You literally can't do anything else.
Right. You cannot be educated, you cannot accumulate wealth, you cannot build a business or innovate if your biological timeline is cut short.
And the numbers here are just, they stop you in your tracks. In 2023, the world average life expectancy is 73.4 years.
And in Guinea-Bissau.
In Guinea-Bissau, it is 64.1 years. That is nearly a 9-year gap. The report calls this the destiny premium.
Destiny premium.
Just sit with that phrase for a second. Destiny premium. Simply based on the geographic coordinates of where you happen to be born, you are granted or denied nearly a decade of existence.
9 years is an eternity in human terms.
It really is.
9 years is the entirety of a child's foundational upbringing. It is the time it takes to see your children graduate, to establish a career, to perhaps meet your grandchildren, to impart generational wisdom to your community.
Losing that.
Losing 9 years to systemic underdevelopment is a profound tragedy. It tells us that the societal infrastructure, hospitals, clean water systems, nutritional supply chains, maternal care is simply not robust enough to protect the biological potential of its citizens.
The environment itself is wearing the human body down faster.
But the research is very careful not to paint this as a story of pure despair. There is historical context here that is actually quite miraculous.
Yeah, if you go back to the source data for 1990, Guinea-Bissau's life expectancy was a tragic 46.9 years.
46.9.
Most people weren't even living to see 50. So going from 46.9 to 64.1, they have engineered a 17.2-year transgenerational leap.
That is monumental.
It really is. How do you add 17 years to a population's lifespan in just 3 decades?
It requires an immense, highly focused mobilization of public health. Gaining 17 years isn't about inventing advanced heart surgery. It's about solving the basics at scale.
Like what?
It means the introduction of basic childhood vaccines for measles and polio. It means the widespread distribution of anti-malarial bed nets, which drastically cuts child mortality.
Oh, wow, right.
It means incremental improvements in basic sanitation, so waterborne illnesses don't wipe out entire villages. These are international aid interventions and internal policy shifts taking root.
But this actually brings us back to a fascinating anomaly regarding that V-shaped shock of the pandemic we discussed earlier.
Right. The 2020-21 drop.
During that dip, the data shows something highly counterintuitive. Guinea-Bissau's drop in life expectancy was actually smaller than the global average drop.
Wait, I remember reading that and doing a double take.
Right. You'd think a nation with a highly fragile, underfunded healthcare system would see a much steeper cliff during a respiratory pandemic than a country with ventilators and ICUs.
Why did their numbers drop less than the heavily developed world?
This is a textbook example of how extreme systemic vulnerability masks acute shocks. When your baseline is already incredibly fragile, when your population is already battling endemic diseases like malaria, widespread nutritional deficits, and a severe lack of advanced medical care.
An external shock like COVID-19 essentially blends into the existing landscape of mortality.
So it's an issue of noise versus signal.
Exactly. In highly developed nations where life expectancy was pushing 80 or 85, a novel respiratory virus caused a massive, sudden spike in excess mortality because those populations had largely eliminated other causes of early death.
So the signal of the virus was stark against a quiet background.
Exactly. In Guinea-Bissau, the tragic reality is that the noise of everyday mortality was already so high that the pandemic didn't register as the same kind of unprecedented statistical cliff.
Plus, they have a very young demographic profile.
Right, because of that historical 46.9-year life expectancy, and we know the virus disproportionately impacted the elderly.
That is incredibly sobering. The resilience they showed during the pandemic wasn't necessarily the resilience of holding a strong shield. It was the resilience of a population already accustomed to absorbing relentless blows.
That's a very powerful way to phrase it.
So they have engineered the 17-year triumph in survival. People are living to 64 instead of 46. But surviving an extra 17 years introduces a new, almost cruel dilemma.
You've kept your population alive longer, but have you built the infrastructure to make those extra years productive?
Exactly. This brings us to the great fault line of human potential: education.
If health is the biological foundation of development, education is the architecture built upon it. It is the ladder of knowledge.
And this is where the disparity between Guinea-Bissau and the world becomes acute.
The UN measures education in two distinct ways to capture both the promise and the reality: expected years of schooling for children entering the system and mean years of schooling for adults already in the population.
And the gap between expected and mean is where the illusions fall away. Globally, the expected years of schooling is 13.0 years.
And in Guinea-Bissau.
It's 10.6 years. Honestly, not terrible on paper. It sounds like they expect kids to get through most of high school.
That looks decent, yeah.
But then you look at the reality, the mean years of schooling. Globally, the average adult has 8.8 years of education. In Guinea-Bissau, the mean years of schooling is exactly 3.7 years.
3.7 years. That single metric is the anchor weighing down their entire development trajectory.
I really want to visualize this. What does 3.7 years of schooling actually look like?
Well, it means the average adult in that country dropped out around the middle of the third grade or the beginning of the fourth grade.
Just imagine being 9 years old. You've just learned basic addition. Maybe you're starting on multiplication. You know how to read simple sentences.
And then tomorrow, you are pulled out of class forever.
You are sent to haul water or harvest cashews or watch your younger siblings while your parents work the fields. That is the peak of your formal education for the rest of your life.
You are operating at 42% of the global educational level.
You cannot build a digital economy. You cannot have widespread advanced agricultural engineering. You cannot even maintain a robust local government if the vast majority of your population's formal education ends before they learn long division.
That narrative illustrates the human cost perfectly.
Yeah.
And what this data reveals is a critical concept we call the lag effect in development economics.
Lag effect.
Yeah, you can build a rural clinic, distribute antibiotics, and raise life expectancy relatively quickly. A targeted health intervention can show measurable statistical results in 5 years.
But education.
Education is a completely different beast. It requires decades of sustained, uninterrupted institutional stability to convert into economic value.
You can't just parachute education in like a box of vaccines.
No, you have to build a physical school, you have to train the teachers, pay them consistently so they don't leave for other jobs.
You have to convince the parents to keep the children in the classroom for 12 years instead of working the farm.
And then you have to wait another decade for those children to grow up, enter the workforce, and start innovating.
So health improvements are a sprint, but education is a generational ultramarathon.
And the tragedy of that ultramarathon in Guinea-Bissau is that they keep getting tripped at mile 3.
Wow.
They have managed the sprint of life expectancy. But the marathon of education has been constantly interrupted by political instability, crumbling infrastructure, and extreme pervasive poverty.
Because when a family is struggling to simply acquire enough calories to survive the week, a child is an economic asset that must be utilized immediately.
Exactly. That 3.7-year reality creates an incredibly low ceiling on what the nation can achieve economically, no matter how long the population lives.
Which leads us directly to the national wallet. If your entire population is effectively leaving school at age 9, what does that do to a country's ability to generate wealth?
It's devastating.
How does a nation compete in a global market with that kind of educational bottleneck?
The short answer is it struggles immensely. And the gross national income, or GNI per capita data, paints a stark picture of wealth polarization on a global scale.
From 1990 to 2023, the global average GNI per capita essentially doubled, going from roughly $11,274 to $20,327.
And just to clarify for everyone listening, this isn't just a raw currency conversion. The researchers use purchasing power parity, or PPP, right?
Yes, that's a crucial distinction. PPP adjusts the income based on the actual cost of living.
Right. It compares what a basket of basic goods, like rice, fuel, and housing costs in Bissau versus what it costs in New York or Tokyo.
It levels the playing field to show true purchasing power.
So when we say the world average became twice as rich, from $11,000 to $20,000, that is a measure of real, tangible wealth improvement.
And over that exact same 33-year period, what happened to Guinea-Bissau?
Their GNI per capita crawled from $1,946 to $2,403.
That is a mere 23% increase over 3 decades of globalization.
The world doubles its wealth, adding nearly $9,000 per person in value, and Guinea-Bissau adds less than $500.
That's not a gap, that's an entirely different planetary economy.
It means wealth polarization is practically becoming genetically coded into the global system.
The rich nations compound their wealth through high-tech industries, financial services, and intellectual property.
Industries requiring 15 years of education.
Exactly. Meanwhile, low-development nations are trapped in low-yield subsistence economies because they lack the educational foundation to pivot.
What this tells us structurally is that social progress in Guinea-Bissau, specifically the public health sprint of living longer, has vastly outpaced their economic structural transformation.
They have more people, and those people are living longer lives.
But the economy hasn't evolved to provide high-value jobs for those people.
It's a demographic bottleneck.
Exactly. You have a growing, youthful workforce with only 3.7 years of education. They enter the labor market and find there are no factories, no tech hubs, no large-scale commercial farms.
So they compete against each other for low-wage, informal labor.
There is no mechanism within the country to capture the economic dividend of their increased life expectancy.
And here's where the research drops the absolute hammer, because even that meager $2,403 average income, it's a complete illusion. Averages are notorious liars.
Oh, the classic joke is, if Bill Gates walks into a dive bar with 99 unemployed people, the average income in that bar is suddenly $1 billion.
Exactly. Averages conceal the pain of a distribution, and the UN has a specific tool to strip away that illusion, the inequality-adjusted HDI, or IHDI.
This brings us full circle to your opening visual, the 21.9% evaporation.
Right, the correct number.
The IHDI is a brilliant, albeit depressing, mathematical tool. It discounts a country's development score based on how unequally health, education, and income are distributed among its citizens.
It reveals the penalty a society pays for unfairness.
It's the inequality tax.
It's worse than a tax, actually. A tax implies the money goes to a public good, like fixing a road. This is a pure elite.
It's an evaporation of potential.
Globally, the world loses 22% of its development potential to this inequality leak. But when we apply the IHDI to Guinea-Bissau, the reality is devastating.
Guinea-Bissau loses a massive 35.6% of its human development simply due to internal inequality.
Their HDI drops from 0.514 all the way down to a staggering 0.331.
I want you, the listener, to feel the weight of that 35.6% loss.
Imagine you work a grueling 40-hour week. You earn your paycheck.
But before you even see the money, before you can buy food or pay rent, a systemic inequality leak automatically drains 35.6% of your life's potential.
You only get to live on roughly 64% of what your country actually produces.
Over a third of your nation's health resources, wealth, and knowledge is either hoarded by a tiny fraction of the elite or lost entirely to systemic inefficiency and corruption.
And the source data shows us exactly where this loss is coming from in Guinea-Bissau. It isn't just an income gap.
No, the data explicitly points out that educational inequality is the primary driver of this 35.6% loss,
The inequality in education in Guinea-Bissau hovers around 42%,
meaning that 3.7-year average we talked about is highly skewed.
drastically skewed. It means a very small elite class in the capital city is likely getting full secondary or tertiary education, perhaps even sending their kids abroad to Lisbon or Paris for university.
Meanwhile, the vast majority of the rural population isn't even getting 3.7 years. They might be getting 0 to 1 year of schooling.
That educational polarization completely shatters the social mobility of the country.
You cannot build a cohesive, functioning society when a third of your potential is evaporating into the pockets of the elite, leaving the rest of the population to fight over the scraps of a 3.7-year education.
It's a structural crisis of the highest order. But who exactly pays this 35.6% tax the most?
Because this burden doesn't fall evenly across the population.
It falls disproportionately, crushingly, on one specific half of the population: women.
The gender paradox in global development is perhaps the most critical barrier to resilience we face today.
You cannot reshape a nation's trajectory if half of its cognitive and economic potential is systematically suppressed from birth.
The UN measures this through the Gender Inequality Index, the GII. This index looks at three vital areas: reproductive health, empowerment, and the labor market.
And the numbers for Guinea-Bissau in the GII are heart-wrenching. Let's look at health first. The maternal mortality ratio.
This is the number of mothers who die per 100,000 live births.
The global average is 216. In Guinea-Bissau, it is 725.
You're more than 3 times as likely to die giving life than the global average.
We have to unpack what a number like 725 actually means operationally.
It indicates a near-total collapse of rural maternal healthcare infrastructure.
It means women are going into labor in remote villages without paved roads.
If a complication arises, say severe hemorrhaging, there is no ambulance to call. They might have to be transported on the back of a motorbike for hours over dirt tracks.
It means clinics lack refrigeration to store oxytocin, which is used to stop bleeding.
It means giving birth without skilled birth attendants or access to emergency cesarean sections.
It is a fundamental systemic failure of the basic human right to survival.
And that disempowerment extends from the delivery room directly into the halls of power.
Globally, women hold about 26.5% of parliamentary seats. It's nowhere near parity, but it represents a voice in how the country is run.
In Guinea-Bissau, the data shows a sharp, regressive drop. Female representation in parliament plummeted from 13.7% down to roughly 9%.
That drop is highly indicative of broader societal instability.
When a country experiences political turbulence, military coups, or extreme economic stress, all of which Guinea-Bissau has faced, there is often a cultural regression to patriarchal norms.
Women are pushed out of the fragile political spaces they had managed to carve out.
They are literally being silenced at the legislative level, meaning the policies needed to fix the maternal mortality crisis will never be drafted because the people dying aren't in the room where the laws are made.
That brings us to the statistic that truly stopped me cold: the adolescent birth rate.
This is a critical indicator. The adolescent birth rate measures births per 1,000 women ages 15 to 19.
The global average has been steadily declining and currently sits at 39.1.
In Guinea-Bissau, the rate is over 82. That is 2.1 times the global average.
I want to dig into the mechanics of this because it's so pivotal. From a macroeconomic perspective, how exactly does a high teen birth rate lock an entire country into a multidimensional poverty cycle?
We intuitively know it's incredibly hard for a young mother. But how does an 82 per thousand rate stall a nation's entire HDI?
It creates an inescapable vicious cycle that instantly destroys the expected years of schooling we talked about earlier.
Think back to that 9-year-old girl. Maybe she made it to age 14 or 15. The moment she becomes pregnant, her formal education almost invariably ends.
The societal stigma, the lack of childcare, the physical demands of pregnancy, she drops out.
The data confirms this brutally. The female mean years of schooling in Guinea-Bissau in 2023 is not 3.7. It is an abysmal 2.47 years.
2.47 years.
Because her education is severed at 2.47 years, she cannot acquire the skills necessary for formal, high-wage employment.
Her physical mobility is immediately restricted by childcare duties in a society with zero state-sponsored support networks.
Her political voice is marginalized because she lacks economic independence.
She is forced into low-yield, informal labor just to feed her child.
And because she is trapped in severe poverty, her child is far more likely to experience malnutrition, to drop out of school early themselves, and to repeat the exact same cycle.
High adolescent birth rates act as a generational lock, sealing families into poverty with almost mathematical certainty.
It's a devastating chain reaction. 2.47 years of schooling. It's almost impossible to comprehend the sheer loss of human brilliance there.
How many potential scientists, writers, agricultural engineers, and visionary leaders are just lost to the daily grinding survival of early, unsupported motherhood?
But this leads us to what the report calls the labor force paradox.
Because hearing all this, the lack of education, the early pregnancies, the maternal mortality, the lack of political voice, you might logically assume that women in Guinea-Bissau simply aren't participating in the workforce.
You'd think they're all relegated strictly to domestic isolation.
But you'd be completely wrong.
This is one of the most counterintuitive findings in development economics, and the data makes it incredibly clear.
The global female labor force participation rate is around 48.5%. In Guinea-Bissau, the female labor force participation rate is a staggering 60.1%.
I had to read that chart 3 times.
Yeah.
They are working more than the global average.
Women in one of the least developed, most educationally deprived countries on Earth have a significantly higher labor participation rate than women in many advanced, wealthy Western nations.
How'd that make sense?
We call this the diligent but poor paradox.
In highly developed nations, high female labor participation usually signifies empowerment. Women choosing careers, breaking glass ceilings, achieving financial independence, delaying childbirth to pursue higher education.
But in countries with extreme low development like Guinea-Bissau, high participation is driven by pure, unadulterated survival instinct.
It's not a choice between a career and staying home. It's a mandate of poverty.
Precisely. When there is no social safety net, no state welfare, and the male income from subsistence farming is insufficient to feed the family, the woman has absolutely no choice but to work.
But remember, she only has 2.47 years of schooling. Her labor is entirely restricted to the lowest, most grueling rungs of the informal economy.
She is engaging in back-breaking subsistence agriculture, hand-processing cashews, street vending, or domestic labor.
She works from dawn until dusk, often with a baby literally strapped to her back. This is extreme labor intensity.
But because it is low-skill and informal, it generates almost zero capital accumulation.
She's trading her physical energy just to stay at zero.
Exactly. It does not translate into elevated economic status, and it certainly does not grant her social empowerment.
She is working endlessly, exhaustingly, just to maintain a baseline of basic survival.
Her labor is essential, but it is invisible to the formal economy.
Diligent, but poor. They are exhausting their bodies and their time, but because the system is structured against them for the moment they are born, their labor evaporates.
It doesn't build generational wealth. And this concept of exhaustion perfectly transitions us into deconstructing what the UN calls multidimensional poverty.
Because this endless cycle of low-yield labor illustrates perfectly why poverty isn't just a lack of money in your bank account. It is a fundamental lack of bandwidth.
The Multidimensional Poverty Index, or MPI, is arguably the most human-centric metric the UN uses.
It looks beyond income, because as we establish, income averages lie, and asks, what is your actual daily lived experience?
It measures deprivations in health, education, and living standards at the household level. In Guinea-Bissau, the incidence of multidimensional poverty is 64.4%.
Meaning nearly 2/3 of the entire population is living trapped in this intersecting web of deprivation.
And the intensity of that poverty, how deeply deprived they are across those metrics, is 52.9%.
But the breakdown of what actually causes this poverty is what shocked me. You'd think it's mostly about lack of cash, but the biggest contributors are years of schooling, which accounts for 20% of the deprivation, nutrition at 15%, and then cooking fuel at 10.5%.
Cooking fuel. 10% of their multidimensional poverty is just trying to cook dinner.
That detail about cooking fuel is the Rosetta Stone for understanding what multidimensional poverty actually feels like.
I want to build on your bandwidth analogy here.
If you live in a developed nation, cooking fuel means turning a dial on a stove and a blue flame appears. It takes 1 second. You don't even think about it.
But if you lack electricity and clean fuel infrastructure, cooking fuel means wood or charcoal. And who is culturally responsible for gathering that wood?
Women and children.
Yes. They might have to walk 2 or 3 hours a day into potentially dangerous areas just to gather enough wood to boil water to make it safe to drink and cook a basic meal of rice.
That is 3 hours of intense physical exhaustion.
That is 3 hours a child is not sitting in a classroom. That is 3 hours a woman is not participating in a microenterprise or resting.
And it doesn't end when they get home.
No, because then they burn that wood indoors in poorly ventilated spaces.
They suffer from severe respiratory illnesses, COPD, chronic pneumonia, eye infections, which degrades their health, requiring more time to recover and costing what little money they have for medicine.
The absence of basic infrastructure, electricity, sanitation, clean water, turns daily survival into a full-time, exhausting job.
It is a literal theft of bandwidth.
It drains the cognitive, physical, and temporal resources needed for education or innovation. You cannot learn to code, you cannot study agricultural biology, you cannot start a business if you are spending 4 hours a day just trying to create fire.
The poverty is multidimensional because it attacks your health, your time, and your mind simultaneously. You are constantly fighting a war on 5 fronts just to exist.
And yet, despite all of this, despite the 2.47 years of schooling, the evaporation of progress, the inequality tax, the daily grind for fuel,
The research report takes the entire paradigm we've been discussing for the last 40 minutes and flips it completely upside down.
yes, the planetary pressures adjusted HDI, the PHDI.
This is where the narrative of developed versus underdeveloped faces a severe, almost uncomfortable moral reckoning.
Up to this point in our deep dive, we and the UN and the global economic system have viewed the global average of 0.756 as the ideal.
It's the standard that Guinea-Bissau is failing to reach. They're the ones lagging behind, the ones who need to catch up.
But the PHDI asks a very pointed question. How did the developed world actually buy that high HDI score?
And the answer is by mortgaging the planet.
The PHDI adjusts a country's human development score by its level of carbon dioxide emissions and material footprint per capita.
It measures the ecological debt a country accumulates to achieve its lifestyle.
And the contrast here is staggering. The average per capita CO2 emission globally is 4.54 tons. In Guinea-Bissau, it is 0.14 tons.
4.54 versus 0.14. Guinea-Bissau's emissions are basically a statistical rounding error.
Exactly. When you apply the planetary pressure penalty, the developed world loses 10.1% of its overall HDI value due to the environmental damage it inflicts.
Guinea-Bissau loses almost 0%. Their PHDI is practically identical to their HDI.
The data clearly shows that the high HDI of the industrialized world is heavily subsidized by toxic carbon emissions and ecological debt that future generations, often in highly vulnerable places like Guinea-Bissau, will have to pay for through climate change impacts like droughts and rising sea levels.
Now, I have to push back on this metric a little bit because it feels like the UN is almost giving them a gold star for being poor.
Isn't this just praising starvation?
They aren't low carbon by choice. They don't have a master plan for green technology. They are low carbon because they don't have factories, they don't have paved roads, and they are spending 4 hours a day gathering firewood.
Is it actually fair to hold them up as an environmental success story?
That is a highly valid critique, and it cuts to the core of the PHDI's philosophical dilemma. You are absolutely right that it is a primitive form of low-carbon development, not an engineered green economy.
They are operating within the biological limits of the Earth by deprivation, not by design.
We shouldn't romanticize their lack of emissions because that lack of emissions is tied to the 725 maternal mortality rate.
However, what the PHDI successfully does is expose the profound hypocrisy of the Western development model.
It proves that the global standard we are telling developing nations to chase is essentially a Ponzi scheme built on toxic, unsustainable debt.
The West achieved high HDI by polluting the atmosphere. If Africa tries to achieve high HDI using the exact same fossil fuel playbook, the planet's ecosystem will simply collapse.
So Guinea-Bissau has an unpolluted slate, They don't have to dismantle a massive entrenched fossil fuel infrastructure like the West does because they never built it.
Precisely. It is an accidental advantage, but an advantage nonetheless in the 21st century.
But, and this is the brutal reality of the global market, in a hyper-globalized, hyper-competitive world, having a clean ecological balance sheet doesn't save you from the math of international competition.
Mother Nature might give Guinea-Bissau a perfect score, but global capital markets do not care.
Unfortunately, that is the harsh geopolitical reality. We see this explicitly in the ranking data over the last few decades.
Despite 30 years of internal progress, despite adding 17 years to their life expectancy, Guinea-Bissau's relative position is precarious.
Their gender inequality index rank continues to slide backward, dropping from 165 down to 176.
Their overall HDI rank is practically frozen in amber at 184.
The report mentions their ranking percentile is actually worsened, falling from the 93rd percentile to the 96.7th percentile.
They are slipping further toward the very bottom of the list.
In evolutionary biology, there is a concept called the Red Queen effect, derived from Alice in Wonderland.
The Red Queen tells Alice, it takes all the running you can do to keep in the same place.
This perfectly describes Guinea-Bissau's development dilemma. They are running, but the size of the playing field is expanding as more countries are added to the index, and the speed of the global standard is accelerating exponentially due to technological revolutions.
Stagnation in global rank doesn't just mean you are standing still. It means actual increasing marginalization.
If you aren't leapfrogging, if you aren't integrating into digital supply chains, you are falling behind.
So we've painted an incredibly complex picture of a nation caught between internal triumphs and a global treadmill that is speeding up.
A nation burdened by a 35% inequality tax, a devastating 2.47-year educational ceiling for women, and a clean ecological record that the market currently refuses to value.
As we look at the conclusions of this massive study, how do we actually fix this? What is the mission going forward?
How does Guinea-Bissau, and by extension the rest of the developing world, reshape this fragile resilience?
The researchers lay out 3 core strategic pillars to alter this trajectory. First, we must focus on closing the distribution dividend.
Economic growth that evaporates into the pockets of a tiny elite is not development, it is extraction.
Policy interventions like progressive taxation, universal basic health coverage, and aggressive anti-corruption measures are desperately needed to claw back that 35.6% inequality loss.
They need to patch the leaks in the plumbing so the water actually reaches the rural populations.
Patching the leaks is step 1. What is step 2?
Precision education. We talked about how general health interventions are a sprint, but education is a marathon.
General education funding isn't enough. It must be surgical. Specifically targeting the female education gap is paramount.
Raising that 2.47-year mean for women is the single most effective way to break the adolescent birth cycle.
When you keep a girl in school until she's 18, her earning potential skyrockets, her health outcomes improve, her children are healthier, and she breaks the generational lock of multidimensional poverty.
It is mathematically the highest yield investment a developing nation can make.
Patch the leaks, educate the women, and the third pillar.
Leveraging the green advantage. Guinea-Bissau cannot follow the carbon-heavy industrial path of the 19th and 20th centuries.
It would destroy their PHDI advantage, and it would be economically inefficient.
Instead, they must leapfrog the fossil fuel phase entirely. They need to use their status as a zero-carbon, high biodiversity nation to attract international climate finance, green development funding, carbon credits, and sustainable agriculture investments.
They must transition from a state of primitive low carbon directly into an advanced digitized green economy.
It's about turning what looks like a historical weakness, the lack of industrialization, into their greatest strategic asset for the 21st century.
You know, listening to all this, dissecting these numbers for the past hour, it really brings us back to that 21.9% evaporation we talked about at the very beginning.
Yeah, the core problem.
I want to remind you, the listener, as you absorb all these massive statistics and global indexes, the ultimate goal of development isn't to pump up a GDP statistic.
It isn't to win a UN ranking or to have the highest output of cashews.
No, the metrics are just proxies.
Exactly. The ultimate goal is freedom.
It's about the freedom for an individual, whether they are born in Bissau, Tokyo, or New York, to choose their own path without the crushing, suffocating gravity of multidimensional poverty, gender bias, and environmental collapse holding them down.
It's about not having to spend 4 hours a day gathering wood So you can spend those 4 hours learning or inventing or just resting.
That is the true essence of human development. It is expanding the bandwidth of choices available to a human life.
So I'll leave you with this final provocative thought to mull over today.
We look at the data and we see that the developed world's path of high consumption is literally destroying the planet's ecological boundaries. The bill for our high HDI is coming due.
Meanwhile, the underdeveloped world's reality of multidimensional poverty is destroying vast amounts of human cognitive potential through lack of education and health.
If both ends of the spectrum are failing in different catastrophic ways, what does a truly successful, fully realized human civilization actually look like? Are we all developed and underdeveloped alike, just chasing the wrong index? Think about it. We'll catch you on the next deep dive.